Hey everyone, let's get the show started. Welcome to our DevOps office hours. It's November 9th, 2022. My name is Eric Osterman, and I'll be leading the conversation. I'm the founder and CEO of Cloud Posse. Cloud Posse is a DevOps accelerator. That means that we help companies conquer AWS using our proven business blueprints for Terraform. If you're starting from scratch or just not happy with what you have today, you can go to cloudposse.com/quiz to book a session with me directly. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz. And I'll show you what the future of your organization could look like with Terraform. For those of you new to the call, the format's very informal. My goal is to get your questions answered today. If you're curious about Cloud Posse or any of our open source tools or modules, this is a great place to ask those questions. We host these calls every week. Our call today is recorded. We'll automatically post a recording of our session today to our YouTube channel. So if you enjoy the content and want to support what we're up to over here, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. Just go to youtube.com/cloudposse. Again, youtube.com/cloudposse. So with that said, let's jump into the announcements. Pretty light week in terms of news. If anyone has other things they'd like to bring up, here were some that RB on the team shared with me. This one's kind of interesting. So I really like this announcement if it means what it says it means to me. So just like recently they announced the ability to delegate AWS SSO to another member account in the organization, which honestly doesn't work very well. We tried it, but this is now that for CloudTrails. And what you can do now is delegate another member account of your organization as the administrator of CloudTrails for organizational CloudTrails. I like this because I think what this means is you can now have separation of concerns, basically checks and balances. So another team can be the administrator of CloudTrails that isn't the administrator of the organization itself. And therefore, like a SecOps team or something like that would be entrusted with it. And therefore, ensure that no administrators are able to tamper with logging capabilities. Now, I'm sure there are other use cases for it, but that's what stood out to me. Anybody else have something else? Another reason why they like this? All right. The other announcement, I also haven't had a chance to check it out yet. It was just shared with me from RB on the team. This is announcing Amazon's Resource Explorer. It sounds like this is finally an easy way to Control F and find anything in AWS when you're in the web console, so to say. It indexes resources across the entire account. And I'm not sure if it is supported in every major region with more coming soon. However, I'm not sure if it supports cross-region searching, which honestly would be kind of nice too. Sometimes you just don't remember where something was deployed. I would just like to have, search everywhere.
It does support cross-region. It does not support cross-account. And okay, I would wait a bit for the service to mature, is my way of putting it very nicely.
Yeah, you kicked the tires on it?
I got a preview of the service and
oh, cool.
The released version is much more disappointing.
Oh, no. So I guess would be interesting then, I wasn't thinking about the cross account, but that'd be really cool too, if you could do that at the organization, at the root of the organization, for example. Search for like, show me everywhere RDS is deployed. And then, you clicking on a link would take you into that account, assuming a role and so forth. That's my pie in the sky wish. That's not what it supports, I'm assuming. All right. Any other comments on this AWS Resource Explorer before we go on? All right. Vlad, you had an announcement, AWS, they announced something regarding to...
Yes, this is from last week, actually. So App Runner, I posted the link in the Zoom chat. Do you want me to post it to Slack too?
Yeah, that'd be cool. I'll open it up here.
Give me a second. So App Runner now supports private services in VPCs. So before you had to go through the internet, now using private link VPC endpoints, you can keep all the traffic and have AppRunner only connect to your VPC. This was a feature that was highly requested by a bunch of folks I work with, and I'm very excited about this launching. They also have a fascinating deep dive blog post and a YouTube video on this. It's a really, really nice launch. They did the deep dive, which is just fascinating, and discussing the different trade-offs they had to do. I really like this launch. It shows how AppRunner is maturing into a better and better service. I'm totally here for it.
That's cool. I'm excited to see that continued investment by Amazon on the service. Next up, I hope they support more instance types. But this is cool. Next announcement is was highly relevant to us, at least. We've started using discussions internally at Cloud Posse. I would expect to see more discussions happening at Cloud Posse publicly in the near future. We are dogfooding it internally and kind of building a practice around it. One of the annoying things was until 6 days ago, there were no RSS feeds from discussions, unlike issues and pull requests and so forth. Now, timing is perfect. Discussions, it was just announced discussions have those feeds. If you're not familiar with discussions are similar to issues, but they have other methods of interaction. So like if we open up, here's first of all the Atom feed for some discussions here at GitHub. But here's what they look like. And what's nice is that they have the concept of polls, for example, so you can solicit feedback from either developers at your organization if it's a private repo or if it's a public. You can do this in any number of GitHub repositories, and you can transfer discussions between repositories, which is really nice as well. Discussions can be converted or into issues, or you can link discussions to issues and so forth. This is taking some of the thunder out of Stack Overflow's sales, or some of the wind out of Stack Overflow's sales, you could say. Obviously, it's not a competitor to it, but for smaller projects, this is a great way to get the same core functionality where you can upvote issues you're having and have threaded comments, which are really nice, not just flat comments. And then there's also the leaderboard, who's being the most helpful, who's answering questions. So I think if one has that at an organization, there should be some reward for being the most helpful. All right, any questions on GitHub discussions and the RSS feeds on that? Oh, one more thing. The reason why I thought that was really cool that they added RSS on that, because when you use Slack, you can now then subscribe to a category or any one of, anything here, you could subscribe to that now as an RSS feed, either in your reader or on Slack channels and so forth. So it's a good way to broadcast announcements, but also have a threaded, efficient conversation as it relates to, things. Vlad, I see a light bulb goes off. All right, moving on to the next discussion. Oh, so this one here, I came across it because the post I saw was that Kubernetes dropped off the top 20 list for the 4th straight year in a row. So as the most active projects in terms of development. I thought it was also a really interesting list I hadn't seen before of the most active projects out there. And I was, we had just talked about Home Assistant the week before last, and I was really surprised to see Home Assistant was in the top 20 of the most active repositories on all of GitHub. This small little, what I conceive to be a relatively small little hacker community on home automation. So anyways, brought that up. Anyone else have something to add to this? All right. The next announcement is, yeah.
Or just for what it's worth, your small community on GitHub or on home automation, that repo has almost 56,000 stars. So clearly there are a lot more people doing that work than you think.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, yeah, that is phenomenal.
And over 20,000 forks.
Yeah, that's pretty phenomenal. Imagine the scale, the effort of maintaining such a project without the resources of Google behind you and the CNCF and all of these other things. I'm really curious about the organizational structure, therefore, of Home Assistant, and what kind of revenue they're driving and so forth to support that project. All right. Next, final announcement that I have is Cloud Posse's hiring. If you are, in the US, a DevOps engineer who wants to move their career in an open source trajectory, we are a pretty awesome place to work. You'll be working with open source every single day, working with Terraform modules, Kubernetes, open source technologies, AWS, and so forth. So if you're interested in, mixing or shaking things up a little bit, do apply and see if, we'll see if you're a good fit for what we're looking for. People who are experienced with consulting are especially welcome to join. We love looking, and this is just a good rubric in general for anybody applying to jobs these days here. I would say it's like, if you can highlight that you have an awesome GitHub profile, that you're very active, that you're not some anonymous person in the shadows lurking there. The more public you are, the more attractive you are to a lot of employers looking over what you're doing. If you have the ability to teach and coach and mentor other engineers within the company and or customers, that's a great skill set. You enjoy being social, Cloud Posse works with the community here. We have the sweetops Slack community, but also working with our customers. So it's a great skill set. If you enjoy being social with other engineers, we're a good place to work. And you have an open source background. That's not a requirement, but it certainly doesn't hurt if you work a lot with open source and other projects. So reach out if you have any questions. So moving on to Q&A, we got a few good questions queued up from the Office Hours channel in the sweetops Slack. If you haven't yet joined, just go to slack.sweetops.com or slack.cloudposse.com. They're the same thing, and you can register. All right, so the first question by Venkata was, does anyone here back up their repos? If so, what services do you use? There was a bit of a thread on that one. I haven't yet had a chance to look through. Let's see what the recommendations were. All right, so one of the recommendations is, of course, if you are also using GitLab, GitLab supports native mirroring, which is pretty convenient. So that's not a bad idea. Looks like there's a few other projects here like gitprotect.io. I think there's another service called Rewind. This is I think the question here is, we're all engineers. I think we can come up with some pretty easy ways to back up GitHub in different ways. I think the bigger question is, how do you back up at a larger scale across the organization, or are you only concerned with backing up GitHub? We are dependent on tons of services these days, things like, well, obviously, like Google maybe for mail and groups, and then you have Lucidchart maybe for your diagrams and Okta and so forth. And how do you have a backup of all that? One great method is, of course, you're practicing infrastructure as code, right? So all of that is in your version control. And if you back up your version control, you're by the transitive property, therefore backing up all these other services. So not a bad start. What I want to throw my hat in for, what I think it is the most enterprise ready option for backing up your Git repositories that will be protected against, like the, what do you call it? The ransomware attacks and the encryption attacks, whatever you call them. is a combination of AWS code commit and AWS backups with Glacier vaults. So it's pretty straightforward to set up, but there's a little bit of hoops you got to jump through. I don't believe AWS code commit supports automatic mirroring yet. I thought it did, but I did some Googling today again and I couldn't find it. Vlad, you're like the subject matter expert on like everything at AWS. Code commit supports mirroring or not?
I am not using any of the
Okay.
code products from AWS, so no
Fair
idea.
enough. So, you know, I poo-pooed on code commit and some of those things at AWS for a long time because compared to, rival alternatives, GitLab, GitHub, they're so much farther superior. However, code commit has a purpose in this whole apparatus. And the way I see code commit as being very valuable is as a Git message bus kind of, or as a Git, as a way to speak Git within AWS. So I wouldn't want to use code commit directly as a developer, but as an interface to other systems at AWS is not a bad idea. So what I would do then is a pattern that was somewhat showcased here. I was looking at something earlier. Maybe I lost it. Here we go. Yeah. So this is not a complete solution. I was hoping to see a little bit more here, but the gist of it is you provision your code commit repository. B, you have your you provision a GitHub repository, you use an existing one. You're probably not terraforming it with this script, let's face it. But then you're going to provision some keys that you would use to talk to the code commit repository, or better yet, you're going to use GitHub OIDC and just assume an IAM role and then be able to push things there, no hard-coded credentials anywhere. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to add a GitHub action workflow that's just going to, push all branches or some branch to code commit, and you can run that on a scheduled job. The reason why we want to get things into code commit, at this point, that's no better than just using GitLab or any of the other version control systems. So it's not that impressive. The point, though, of getting everything into code commit is now you can use AWS backups. So now you can have a snapshot of your repository that is absolutely immutable and can't even be deleted and can be subject to other lifecycle rules and constraints, and can be stored offsite in in offline storage, and every backup mode supported by AWS backups. So that's why I feel like that's the most enterprise friendly solution. Any contradictions or other suggestions to this?
I haven't used AWS backup, but I imagine it offers some kind of alerting if it were to fail, right? Or does it just always work?
I mean, AWS backups is a fully managed service by AWS. So
So
I mean,
it should work. Like it's like S3 replication. It usually just works. It's pretty rare if you're missing an object, I would imagine.
And AWS replication or S3 replication is like a feature of S3, and S3 itself is pretty robust. I presumably could fail. AWS backups, its sole responsibility is managing backups at scale on AWS across all of your services in a consistent manner.
Oh, cool. Looks like Tim just shared a comment. You create alarms on copy/backup failures and etc. So yeah, that definitely sounds like a more robust solution than using some of these other services that offer unlimited repos for like $30 a month. Or you wonder,
and you really don't know who those people are, and you're entrusting them with the IP of your entire organization. If you are an AWS shop, I think this is and you're relatively sophisticated in your usage of AWS, and you understand the concepts here. I don't think this would be more than a 1-day, 2-day project to implement end to end. And then it falls under the umbrella of your current AWS bill, whatever negotiated enterprise discount program you have, etc. So.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Eric, for what it's worth, there's a there's a mirror flag on Git push that you can do that will actually mirror your entire repository to like another source, another destination repository.
You mean on GitHub? Oh,
On Git itself.
on Git itself.
Yeah.
Huh. So Git, the CLI supports automatically mirroring?
Yep.
Oh, learn something new. I never heard of that. I mean, I wouldn't want to rely on that entirely because that's obviously at the end user or CLI level. But that's pretty convenient, especially for the GitHub action that would be implementing this.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If you were going to run a GitHub action, you can do it with a single command, where you basically you just say git push -- mirror, and then the Git path to the destination, and it will mirror your entire source repo to that destination.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one point, if I may. Like,
Yeah, go
it's
for it.
useful to have a Git repository backups in place, and that's good. But I'd also suggest considering zooming out a little bit and thinking about why you want to have those GitHub backups in place, right? What are the value streams that you're trying to protect? When I say value streams, what I mean is like, what are the actions that you're trying to protect? What is the situation that you're trying to recover from? One of those situations might be a APT successfully is able to take down your main site and then wipe your repository for your monolith repo or whatever your app repo is, and you want to recover from that. So if you think about the situations in which the need for these backups arise, then you'll be able to understand what's the MTTR, the mean time to recovery, that I'm shooting for to recover from these situations, and what systems do I need to put into place to have those backup paths in place, and does that actually meet my requirements for, hey, bringing my site back online the same day or the next day, depending on what your requirements are.
Yeah, so a good point to all of this is you might want to add a little README there on how to recover, regardless of the solution you pick. Because it really sucks doing that under duress when you haven't touched it, hopefully for like 2 years, but you're like relieved that you did it 2 years ago, and now it's come to fruition, what your worst fear. Well, it's not good that it came to fruition, but it's good that you had a plan in place. All right. Next topic was, let's see here. Perfect. This is great because it's so apropos, because literally today a member on my team was just raving about how positive their experience has been with using ACT locally for local development of GitHub action workflows. If he hadn't done this lately, I would have relied on feedback I'd gotten from another engineer about 2 years ago, and how frustrated he was using ACT because he got everything working in ACT only for it not to work when he pushed it up to GitHub. I think things have matured a lot since then. And yeah, Matt, can you take it from here and explain a little bit? And even if you want to screen share or anything, that'd be kind of cool for anybody doing GitHub Actions development to understand local development.
Yeah, actually, let me just close a couple of windows and then I can share real quickly.
Well, while you do
So,
that, you can set up more of the background here. Or...
yeah.
Okay.
So ACT or ACT or whatever, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, is basically it emulates GitHub Actions in Docker, so it allows you to then go ahead and just iterate on your action locally. And I just stopped. I mean, I cleared up a couple things so I can actually run it, because I'm legit right in the middle of debugging in action, so I can show everyone that. So let me just see if I can share. Oops, I don't want to share my whole screen. I'm just going to share my terminal. Wait, why didn't it ask me? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So can everyone see my terminal?
Yep.
Cool. So basically this is, and let me just bump it up a little bit so everyone can read it. So basically this is I'm actually writing a GitHub action right now that that downloads and sets up our Atmos tool in in GitHub based on version spec and a bunch of other stuff being passed into it. So here I'm basically saying I want to run Act with and because I'm running on an M1 chip, I actually have to specify the architecture of the container I want because I want it to be AMD 64. Otherwise, it will try to match my processor architecture. And then here I'm telling it that I want to emulate a pull request. And then -J is the job that I'm running. So in my actual GitHub action in my repository, it's actually running the build job. So when I run this, it will actually just start a Docker container and kick off in debug mode, which is also useful if you're doing debug logging, which you can see I'm doing a bunch of here. But what this will actually do is run your GitHub action right here in Docker, and you can see all the output. And essentially, instead of having to make a commit, make a change, make a commit, push it to GitHub, and then merge it to main, because a lot of the changes will only run things that happen off of main, depending on what your spec is. You can now just iterate on this process over and over and over again until you get your GitHub action right, and then you pass it right up to. Then you can push it up to GitHub once it actually passes. So, yeah, the only gotcha to this whole thing is that the image, the full image that most closely replicates the GitHub environment with all the tools is about a 20 gig Docker image. So you have to pull that and keep that around on your desktop if you actually want to do that. But I find it well worth it to speed up the time that it takes to go over and over and over running this action here. So
I think it's especially interesting to point out because the kinds of actions you're working on, and this was your other observation, just that the GitHub script has gotten so good for developing actions that actions don't have to be primitive shell scripts anymore. They can be full-fledged TypeScript applications with their own test framework and so forth.
Yeah, and in fact, that's what this is here. So it's building. It's actually building like it's built as a full TypeScript application that does a bunch of things, a bunch of checking, and actually talks to the repository and gets lists of versions and matches them for valid versions and all of those kinds of things, which would be really difficult to do in just like Bash. It would be very, very ugly code, which makes and it's much prettier in TypeScript and much easier to not only code but also to test and make sure that it works properly. So yeah, I've been pretty happy with it so far, and I used it a few years ago. It was terrible, and I started using it again maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and it seems to be much better now. So
Srinan, did that answer any of your questions? Do you have any more questions based on that?
Yes, it did answer. You did kind of say that is it necessary I need to kind of pull in the 20 gig one, or is there any other option for me? Yeah,
there's 3 different options for which when you set it up for which image you use. The only thing is that the smaller images don't contain all of the tools that GitHub Actions contain by default when you use like runs on like Ubuntu latest, when you use that tag inside the action. You have to pull down the large one if you want it to most closely replicate that. Otherwise, in your action, you may have to install a bunch of things that are already installed by default in GitHub. So if you want it to closely mirror it, you need that big one. But if you don't care about that, or you're not using a bunch of external tools, then you can use the smaller libraries that they have, or the smaller Docker images that they've published for that. And I believe you can even use your own custom image too. I didn't get into that level of depth because I didn't need it. I bit the bullet and downloaded the 20 gig image once and just keep using it, so it works fine.
Got it. Thank you.
I also, if I may add some things, that I also use Act to kind of develop my workflows as well. But I do want to make the case in case somebody is perhaps thinking they could use it for everything. You can't use Act for everything. There's two situations I know of at least where you have to kind of fall back to the old commit and push method. One is if you ever use an OIDC provider, that won't work on your local desktop, of course. So that's not available to you. You can, if you want to get fancy and have Act only jobs or steps, you can actually use a conditional that if it's inside an Act, then only run these steps here. But at that point, I feel like you're kind of moving away from the original point of Act. The second thing is I don't think there's service support yet. So if you have service that you spin up, for example, to run a CI against against the Postgres instance, I don't think that works yet. So those are two situations where Act may not be for you. But otherwise, it's as Matthew says, really great.
Can you tell me more about the services you're talking about?
Yes. So in GitHub Actions, you can define services as in Docker images to run before your job. So you might spin up a MySQL instance or a Redis instance or a combination of other backend services that your front end or your application needs in order to operate and to run its specs. So those might be some services that you spin up, and it's literally called services is the main keyword in the GitHub workflow. But that specific keyword isn't supported in Act.
Okay. Great context.
Yeah, although there is an open issue that they say they're working on it. So, which again, a couple of years ago when I looked at this, they hadn't even acknowledged that was a limitation to what they're doing. So, yeah.
All right. Let me just check the chat if there were any additional questions there. Okay. Next question that I logged was also from the Office Hours Slack channel. David Gregory asks, we've been trying out Spacelift and it obviously rocks. It seems to think in pure Terraform though. So I would love to know or see how you dovetail it with Atmos. All right. So this is where I'm glad you asked the question, and the answer is pretty simple, but it might be a little bit radical to think about it because it's so far from how a lot of people approach Terraform. So the gist of it is all we've done at Cloud Posse is defined a YAML stack configuration format. Oops, wrong place. That we call a stack configuration.
Can I say something really quick before you go down that path?
Okay.
At the highest level, I think the answer to this is Atmos is pure Terraform, and that's why it works with.
Yeah.
And that's why it works with with Spacelift.
Yeah,
and then Eric will tell you why right now.
Yeah.
So that's the quick.
Yeah. No, thanks. So that's good. I'm just recalibrating in my head, kind of based on that. So there's a few things here. Yeah. So there is two parts. So I guess let's take one step back. For everyone who's not familiar with Spacelift, first of all, I did jump the gun on that. Spacelift is a Terraform Cloud alternative. It's in this category of products we call tacos, Terraform automation and collaboration software. Spacelift is unique in that it doesn't only support Terraform, it does support other frameworks for infrastructure as code. It is not trying to be a replacement to or competitive with GitHub Actions. It is not an alternative to, it is solving a different problem. It is solving how do you manage complex approval workflows that you typically need when you're doing things like infrastructure that you don't typically maybe need in the same way when you're doing application deployments. So we're talking about how do you inspect plans before they are deployed? How do you have approval gates, before the plan, after the plan, and how do you reconcile if there's drift in your infrastructure and so forth? So it's solving that, it's in that problem space. So Spacelift runs Terraform. It supports any project, natively written in Terraform. Technically, they've added support for some other mainstream tools that are popular with Terraform. I'm talking about TerraGrunt, for example. So it supports TerraGrunt. But what about Atmos? So Atmos is Cloud Posse's tool that we use for workflow automation. We've talked about it we talk about it all the time, but most recently, a couple of weeks ago, I think we had a demo on Atmos. And yet Spacelift doesn't support Atmos. Why are we such big proponents of Spacelift if it doesn't support the tool we wrote? Because the tool we wrote doesn't break Terraform. It is just using native Terraform. All we are doing with Atmos is managing basically var files. It's a glorified YAML map reducer that can support inheritance and layering and some other opinionated things that we've done, and it generates var files. So the other thing we've done is, since we've so that's that. Now let me show. So there's the one side is, how do you configure Terraform? How do you configure Spacelift itself? And then how does Spacelift run your project? So I'll address those 2 points. So to make things a little bit less opaque, let's just look at briefly what Spacelift looks like. All right, so this is Spacelift in a nutshell. It's a relatively modern UI, supports advanced filtering on any number of dimensions here. I've reduced it to this set because I think it's the most valuable folder. These are arbitrary labels that we add to our stacks. And we have it broken down in this way. So it's like the admin stack and the platform organizational unit and US East 2 region. Here's the resources running in, for example, the staging account. Every one of these configurations here, I'm pointing to my screen like you can see that. Every one of these configurations here, every one of these, what Spacelift calls a stack, it's confusing, it's not what we call a stack, but this is a Terraform root module that's been invoked somewhere. And that configuration needs to be created somehow. So how do you do that? You use Terraform. You use Terraform to define a Spacelift stack. And then you tell it, look at this GitHub repository at this path, and here are a bunch of policies to enforce. Like when these files change, then this stack should be planned. And when those, when that plan is approved, it should be applied and so forth. That's what Spacelift does. So what we've done is not different from what actually a lot of people are doing when they're thinking about infrastructure these days. One is that they're starting to think about defining their configurations in ways that are not just your Terraform bars in HCL. They're starting to use like YAML. I've seen even other members in sweetops here that aren't using Atmos, they're still using YAML for configuration because it's a great way to configure things that everybody understands. So that's what we've done. We've defined a YAML configuration that represents every Terraform root module that we call a component here in a stack, which is just a logical collection of root modules. So guess what we can do now? So we have this YAML definition of what we want our entire architecture to look like. We can do anything we want to do with that YAML. So what we did is we wrote a Terraform module to do that. It's called it's this Terraform Spacelift Cloud Infrastructure Automation. This Terraform module basically consumes the YAML and then terraforms Spacelift. And then Spacelift just calls all of your Terraform root modules just as normal, because when you use our tool chain, you're just using vanilla Terraform. There's some complexity behind the scenes. That complexity is, offloaded into this module. This module is under active development, and we use it in every one of our engagements. And that's the kind of the gist of the solution. The other thing that we've done is we wrote a Terraform provider. And this Terraform provider is capable of consuming the Atmos, all the Atmos stack configurations, all that YAML, so you can read it natively from within Terraform. So this is yeah, this is the, I think I'm not looking at the right. I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right config there, but yeah, this is it, I guess, the stack Spacelift. I don't know why we call this Spacelift stack config. It's just a Atmos stack config. Oh, it's this one here, I guess. So here's an example of using this data source. And this data source, you can just pass it a list of your YAML stack configs and you can read it from Terraform. So that's the beautiful thing, is that we wrote this in YAML. Because it's in YAML, we can read and write it from every language. It's not tied to Terraform. We wrote Atmos so we can use it with Kubernetes, Helm file, Helm, and all these other tools that we use. So that's why we didn't choose to use HCL for that. And then we can still read it all from within Terraform because there's a provider to do that. David, did that clear things up? Any questions?
Yeah, that's good. That's not what I was expecting you to say. I was expecting you to go via kind of variables and injecting them, but this is clever.
So you know what the amazing other thing is about this? Someone else in our community wants to use this with Atlantis, and Atlantis uses YAML as well. So what we did is we just added a command to Atmos to generate the Atlantis server config. And that means that this is now compatible with Atlantis. We also wrote a command that will export every single var file for you. So in one command, you can generate every var file for every single component in every single stack. And now you have just pure vanilla Terraform with var files. That means you could use this with Terraform Cloud. So because if you use this strategy that we have, it's compatible pretty much with every solution out there. And we invest the most time and effort right now in Spacelift with the intention of supporting additional platforms as the need arises.
Great, thanks. I feel like I had another question, but I forgot what it was, so just
feel free. All right. Anyone have any other questions about this or anything else?
Yeah, I had a question about what you just talked about and how that relates to Atmos generating the backend when you run the commands normally, in that, you know, like say, for instance, you have the same component deploying to multiple stacks. If you change stacks on the workspace, it's not in the new stack, Terraform will prompt you to select the workspace every time. Are there any plans to introduce similar functionality so that that's not a necessity?
See here. So the best person to ask on this would be in the Atmos channel, and we can tag Andre, who knows some of the deeper internals on this. But in terms of selecting the workspace, actually, this is something recently we realized that would mitigate the need for some of the, like the running that command first, is you can set the workspace by environment variable. So that would, I'm not sure if that addresses exactly your question, but that would help with that case.
Yeah, I'll have to test it around. Currently, what I end up doing is just modifying the environment file in the .terraform folder, which prevents it from giving you that error.
Okay. Yeah, try setting the environment variable. I think for that specific use case, it should address it. Obviously, for a lot of this stuff, it also, I mean, there's some conventions we follow that enable this. One of those conventions we follow is that we use Terraform workspaces the way we believe they were intentioned to be used. And Terraform works, you know, so there's a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt around using Terraform workspaces, and a movement against using them and that they're evil. And yet a lot of people still use the same S3 bucket with different bucket paths. Workspaces are just different bucket paths in an S3 bucket. So that fear, uncertainty, and doubt is, in my book, unmerited. So if you use workspaces, then it's really convenient because you can use the same exact backend configuration and just change an environment variable and access a different path of an S3 bucket to get the state for that. It's not any more error prone than other mechanisms out there. And when you are using Terraform at scale, there should always be a tool in between the end user and Terraform anyways that enforces your kind of policies and controls.
Yeah, that makes sense. The main place that I tended to run into that issue was when the backends were different between the stacks. And so the buckets were not the same. Therefore, the workspace is not in the bucket that it's now pointing to.
Yeah, exactly. So when you do run into this situation where the backend is not you might, for example, let's say you're deploying an S3 bucket, or maybe let me not say S3 bucket because that's going to be confusing. You're deploying a VPC. And the VPC is using one S3 bucket when it's deployed over here, and a totally different S3 bucket when it's deployed over here. Well, now you're in this rock and a hard place where there is no way to parameterize your backend configuration so that it will be reusable if in both those situations. You have two options. You generate that backend configuration, which is why Atmos supports the backend generation, or you use some other tool that manages that config file, or you edit it, or other options.
What about partial configurations as far as having Atmos just generate the the inner part of the backend and then just have in the actual components just a blank backend?
So, but so that's one option. What we decided was the elegant solution in this situation was that Terraform HCL is entirely like you can write HCL in JSON, right? And so therefore we just describe what that backend looks like in the YAML configuration, and then we generate it as JSON. So it's programmatically generated. This is an opinionated thing. This is us saying that we think it's more elegant just to generate the whole file and have it programmatically generated as JSON, which as opposed to templating Terraform code. There are different camps. There's no right or wrong answer. It was just our opinion, our opinion that this was a nicer way to do that. There's another tool called TerraPlate, for example, that's all about Terraform templating, which we haven't gone down that route yet.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that it's clear that in a stack config, if you're using Atmos, you can, in a particular stack, like in the prod environment versus in the dev environment, you can override the backend config in there, and then when it gets deep merged, you can achieve exactly what you were saying. You just have to do it through the YAML stack config versus partially in the YAML and partially like through the actual like HCL, which it sounded like you were asking for. But in this case, if like the line 12 right there, the bucket and the and then the path and the bucket as an example are different. For a particular environment, you don't need, you can just go to that particular stack config in prod and provide that key, those three lines that Eric highlighted right there. And you can override those things for a particular stack.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of what I'm already doing, but once it generates the backend file, it still generates the same file name, the backend.tf.json file. So there's only the one file at a time. And if you say, for instance, have multiple stacks, there's not really any way to represent all the backends that it could potentially have.
Well, you
And,
don't.
the thinking was that
Yeah,
if
we
you had
don't commit those files. We only they just get generated and discarded. So yeah, you're right.
Where I ran into this issue was I was trying to figure out a way to use Atlantis, and I was running into some issues where the backends weren't matching. So what I ended up doing was just copying in a blank backend file when it's running through Atlantis rather than using the normal Atmos commands, and then just have it generate the backend files.
I see.
And copy them in.
Mm-hmm.
I see the problem you're having. Let me try and break it down. Let me reiterate, so I think everyone who follows might follow as well, the problem and maybe what some ways to mitigate it are. So Atlantis is another like Terraform Cloud alternative. You could say Atlantis kind of started the movement, if we will. The project is Run Atlantis, for those of you not familiar with the project. So Atlantis has this concept of a repo config. And I have an old one laying around publicly here somewhere. I'll just pull it up for the purposes of this here. So this is an Atlantis repo configuration, for example. And Atlantis can only operate on differences that GitHub reports. So in a pull request. So if the pull request says, you know, these files changed, then Atlantis will wake up. So what Cloud Posse just said is don't commit your backend file. And that means that if you are tweaking your backend, Atlantis isn't going to detect that because that Terraform file didn't change. Well, what you have the option to doing then is playing with other files modified. So in this case, you're going to want to make your stack dependent on some other YAML configurations. When those change, then this stack should be replanned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was actually the route that I started going down, but I ran into an issue where my stacks were too dynamic and I couldn't map the paths correctly. So I ended up reverting to just generating the var files because that allowed me to have a single place to reference.
Yeah. It's a good problem. I mean, I think I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. It makes sense. Well, I'm going to have to noodle on that one a little bit more, bring it back to the team also on the most elegant way of solving that. Yeah, it would.
We could actually generate all the backend configs as override files. And then you could specify which one you want for that environment, right? I think that would work.
I don't think you can, well, I mean, you have to delete the ones that you don't want and leave the one you do want, right? So you generate like, you know, a dev staging prod override file. Each one would be overriding each other, but you delete the ones that you don't care about and you leave the one you do care about.
Yeah, exactly.
Could another possible alternative be to add the backend config flag to the Terraform init that runs so that you can then specify it as part of the YAML?
We support all the flags that Terraform supports. So if you want to do that, you can already do that. But you cannot, like, what would be ideal is you could specify which TF file to use as the backend. But you can't do that. You can only specify explicitly every argument as, you know, that comprises the backend. That would be an option. We would then need to implement that generation of the CLI flags, CLI flags for that. That would be a good, what I would recommend you do, Joe. That's a good issue to open up in the Atmos issues. Let's get the conversation started on it, and then we'll figure out which way to implement it. I believe it's worth finding a solution that will, you know, that is not a hack per se, and is a scalable way of managing that situation.
Yeah, I think the backend, if we were to commit the backend config to disk, you can actually configure it as a config. You could actually commit it as a partial config, and then we can only use the CLI arguments to override the things that we want to override. You don't need to specify every single one.
That's a good point.
That's actually what I'm doing right now, but I'm just doing it as a mix-in. So I just have a mix-in file that just has an empty backend so that it's not actually in the components. And then when it runs through Atlantis, it then copies in the mix-in file at runtime.
Yeah, I think we would be able to implement this by extending some of the default arguments through the settings of Atmos. So then you could do it generically. Go on, Matt.
Yeah. So I was just saying, when we call Terraform, like instead of actually writing it out to the file, we could actually just run, I think it's -backend -config, and then those are just key value pairs that go with it. So we could just take the YAML, like the reduced YAML, and instead of actually writing it out to the file, we could actually just, for each one of those, just add it as a -backend config quote, whatever it is, S3 bucket equals foo, and whatever the other things are. And I think that would actually take care of it through YAML. I mean, through like,
It would. So what I realized though, because I was going down the same path, but then we're still defining it in a YAML, then it's still not going to be associated with the files changed relative to this path. And it's probably going to still have the same problem. So there needs to be a file emitted, just like the var files, for Atlantis to work very well.
Well, the TF-vars file will change, right?
TF-var.
I mean, presumably if you're trying to do a deployment of this component, you've changed some variable. When we pass the TF-vars file to it, that will be the thing that actually changes. And then you have all the.
Yeah, that's actually what I'm doing. I just generate the var files through a pre-commit hook, so that they just get generated before committing them automatically.
But if you're changing the backend might not necessarily be tied to the var files at all. That is just that's just optimism to hope that the var files would change, because the backend itself supports zero parameterization. And if we're saying that we want to vary the S3 backend, for example, and we're doing that in the YAML, we're just back to the square one. It has to be in one of the TF.
Well, I mean, I think what you're missing though, or maybe I'm missing it. I think what I'm saying is that if you're doing something that triggers the deployment of this, you're going to be changing a variable, right? Like in order for a plan to get triggered, or in order for a deploy to get triggered, you're going to either change the code or a variable. I guess you're saying if the only thing that you changed was the backend file,
and that's
at all, then then that would be a problem.
Yeah,
I could see that for sure being the case.
Yeah, and in my case, I'm just not really worrying about that, because the backends are all set up separately, and it's not tied to what Atlantis is doing. So I'm just going under the assumption that these are fixed backends.
Well, what we can do is maybe just generate an MD5 checksum of the entire config, and we write that as a comment in each of the var files for that environment. That way, even if none of the variables change, that signature will change, indicating that there's something else about this configuration, and that solves this. It doesn't just solve the backend; it solves anything at all about how you're running Atmos has changed. Therefore, you should rerun these stacks. So I'm going to propose that at least. Joe, thank you for bringing this up again. Do open up that PR. We are out of time for today. This was a good conversation. Hope we didn't bore everyone else off by talking shop there intently for the last 15 minutes. All right, let's see here. Moving on to this. Yes, just a reminder, if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. It helps us out a great deal. Subscriber counts are a factor of how YouTube prioritizes videos and enables us to eventually have sponsorship opportunities on our channel. So go to youtube.com/cloudposse and subscribe. It would help us out a great deal. Again, if you are interested in a career in open source, Cloud Posse is a great place to check out. Go to cloudposse.com/careers. Again, cloudposse.com/careers to find out if you'd be a good fit for Cloud Posse. To register for our weekly office hours, head over to cloudposse.com/office hours. Again, that's cloudposse.com/office hours. You can also stay in touch with all of our office hours episodes via podcasts. Just podcast.cloudposse.com and use whatever medium you like. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, guys. That's great.